So my presentation is called Rediscovering the Sacred, and it's a shortened version that I'm presenting to you. I do have the whole thing there, and if I go through it, we might get through the whole thing. We'll see. So I did a lot of driving this year, and it was propelled by grief. I was armed with my iPhone and Google Maps and iNaturalist, and I trekked out as often as I could to document cut blocks within about 2 hours of Tatamagouche in time to post a comment before the deadlines. So after, we had several presentations in the spring from experts telling us how we could stop some of these cuts. And using that information, I was looking for rare and endangered species. And these red blocks, if you're wondering what those are, those were posted cut blocks that I got to this past year. More than 2 contiguous acres of old growth forest. I was looking for that. Proximity to protected areas. And as some of you know, that was happening. And by the way, finding old growth forest didn't necessarily stop a cut, as you no doubt know. Wetlands are not supposed to be cut, but they are being. And rare and endangered landscape types. And hoped against hope that my findings would make a difference. So I got out there during the comment periods. I did my best just trekking through all these plots, and then I did my comments. And of course, while flora folk, you try and say that fast, like us, are notorious for noticing nothing but what is beneath our feet. So I had to learn to train myself to look up and to notice everything around me, and also to listen, because we had to be, checking for birds as well. And I don't know my birds, I'm not a birder, but thank goodness the iNaturalist app has a recording feature on it. So I could record things that I heard and post them to iNaturalist, and people helped me. And as I continued my lonely travels out to remote parts of Nova Scotia to really, let's be frank, bear witness to impending ecocide, it slowly dawned on me that I was not, in fact, walking alone. This is true. At first, I thought it was simply the squirrels and chickadees and ravens that were helping me with my task. And I'm telling you, it's unbelievable. I would be about to give up, and a squirrel would make a noise, or a chickadee and a raven, and it was almost like they were insisting, come this way, and I would find something. But I was wrong. It wasn't just them. I wasn't alone out there. And just as we try to provide direction, support, and protection to our children and hope they'll pass these values along, so too has a sacred legacy been left on the land by the Ulnug, the people of Mi'kma'ki. Excuse my pronunciation, anybody who's a native speaker. And thanks to Donald Marshall's trial and the resulting Mi'kmaq Nova Scotia Canada framework, which is the Made in Nova Scotia process, since 2007, there has been another way to trigger a halt to deforestation. So I'm going to give you an example. It's a very recent one that I went to less than a month ago. So it's a good one because it really has some interesting features to it. So the location, this is a locator map for you guys, is between Amherst and Spring Hill. It's over here. And this is another site nearby that I walked. These green marks are my iNaturalist postings. The actual site is here, and it goes further. I usually can never get right into the whole, I can't walk the whole things. This one, for example, this cut block was almost 200 acres, and I visited it twice. I went 2 days, and they want to clear cut 200 acres. Okay, this is the prescription for these 4 cut blocks. Even a shelter wood is actually a clear cut. What they do is they take the marketable wood and leave some big trees, and then they come back in a couple of years later and they cut down all the rest of the trees. So it was to be completely clear cut. And the comment deadline on this particular site was less than a month ago. And this was when I visited the site. So this is my site example for you guys. And here's my little title here, Walking with Onug near Little Forks Landfill. And if you're wondering what the heck is Onug, Onug is the people, and that's what the Mi'kmaq actually call themselves. Mi'kmaq means friends, and Onug, which is what they call themselves, means the people. So before I set out on my field trips, I use my iPhone Google Maps app to pin the cut block boundaries, because that will track me and I'll know when I'm actually inside the cut block. I also use this app to plan my driving route. And I also look at the aerial photographs to see what's going to be the most interesting way to hike in. So for example, this particular site, I parked my car here. And the reason I did that, I could have parked anywhere up here because I had to hike into the site, but was because I could see from the aerial photograph that this was old growth hardwood. And even though that was not actually in the cut block is down here, and you can see there's old growth hardwood here. I knew that this would be an interesting way to hike in. And I might find some cool stuff. This darker stuff here is almost invariably black spruce bog when you see dark stuff like that. And when it's this thick, it's probably old, but maybe not old growth. In this case, access to the area was through a service road into a huge, active and expanding landfill. Humongous, unbelievably big. So I had to drive right through that, and it's just off the map here. So there's a lot of destruction that's already happened in this area. And I drove past it, and I parked my little car on the roadside. Probably I parked it right here because I hopped out and immediately tucked my head into the woods on both sides of the road looking for features. Well, I wasn't disappointed. I started taking photographs right away using my iPhone iNaturalist app. And the very first thing I saw was that the Onug had left me a trail. So we need to talk about trail trees. And one of our members had introduced the idea of trail trees at one of our earlier talks in the spring, and it had been kind of picking away at in my head. So here's a good example of a trail tree. This was the first trail thing I saw when I poked my head here into the old growth that was on this side of the road. And this particular trail tree has a low branch. So trail trees can tell you about seasonality. If it's a low branch, then you know that this trail was not used, or this particular part of the trail was not used in the wintertime, because you wouldn't be able to see that if you had a good snow, which they would have had in the good old days. This is another type of trail tree that maybe most of you are more familiar with. This type of trail tree was the kind where they would have tethered it somehow, and then as the trees sprouted up, as a little branches sprouted up, they would cut these off and trim it. Okay, so that's probably another type that you guys are more familiar with. And you can see that in this case, this horizontal strip is a little higher. So this one, definitely this trail could have been used in the winter. So let's translate the trail tree. And I'm not an expert on this, except that I have been following them. Okay, so when I first got out there, I was just kind of trying to figure out, what do these trees mean? Do they mean something? And I had faith that they did, but I don't know about you guys, but I had been told that these branches point somewhere. And so at first I was kind of thinking, well, where is it pointing? Is it pointing in this way, or is it pointing in that way? Well, it turns out that that is actually a completely wrong interpretation. These are actually path trees, and it makes complete sense when you think about it. So these are linear. And what you're doing is, if I'm standing over here, I have to be able to see this tree. I have to be able to see it from the last one. Okay. So if I'm to see it, if I need a direction, my direction has to be right through the middle of the fork. And that indeed is the case when you follow these trees. you'll find that if I stand with my back to this tree, if I'm coming from this direction, I stand with my back to this tree, I will be able to see within my viewing distance the next tree. Okay, so if you're out in the woods and you come across a tree like this, have a look behind you, have a look in front of you, in between the forks. That's your path. The turn trees. The turn trees are really cool too. So you're coming along, you're following your linear tree, and you see a tree that has two different branches sticking out at different directions. So I'm coming along this way. Hope you can see my arrow. And I get to here and it's telling me stop. You'll be sorry if you keep going in this direction. There's a bog here. Make a little turn and we promise you we'll help you get over this wet patch. And sure enough, they do. So as I'm going along, I'm not only using these trees for direction, but I'm also noting the age, the species, the branching character, and the height of the cultural modification. So we already know why I'm looking at the height. That gives me seasonality. We know why we're looking at the branching character. That tells me my direction. We already kind of can guess, doesn't take too much to guess why I'm looking at the age. I want to know when is the minimum possible age that some cultural activity was going on in this area. Why do I want to look at the species? Well, it turns out that the species are very important as well, because you will often find as you're going through these trails that it'll be the same species that takes you along the whole path, even though that particular species may not normally grow in that particular ecology. So in fact, what these trail trees are showing us is that these not only were deliberately culturally modified, they were in fact probably planted. Somebody was maybe carrying an ash basket with a bunch of trees in it and going along and planting them. And the reason that I've come to this conclusion is because sometimes I would find that there had been plantings done at different ages and different species, marking the same trail. So maybe grandfather planted them 80 years ago and passed that knowledge on to his grandson, who then came along with a different species of tree and then planted a whole bunch of, let's say, balsam fir. Okay, it's really, really interesting and cool. Another type of tree that you will find are crossroad trail trees. So it will be like a path tree, but instead of having just one fork, you'll have another fork as well. So the branches will be opposite each other, but it'll be two trails intersecting. So that's a crossroad trail tree. And I have a picture here of also a multi-branch tree where several trails could terminate, but it might not be several trails. It might just be one trail. And when you have one trail terminating, so here you can see trail trees that are leading me here to this spot. When you have, and it was just one trail, when you have a whole bunch of branches all of a sudden coming out, often it's the same species as is here, but usually it will be an older tree. It'll be a relic tree from perhaps the last time someone had planted the trail. That's what I would call an arrival tree. Okay, it's a tree that has all these branches coming out of it and it says, stop, stop, stop. Look, this is a sacred spot. Another type of tree that you will see are called I call them twist trail trees. And this is where two trails connect. It could be indicating a meeting spot. Often they're two different species, but not always. So here's one that has two different species twisting together. And here's one that has the same species twisting together. So I'm suggesting, I don't know if it's true, potentially grandfather maybe walked from one direction along the trail and met grandson coming this way, and they celebrated by twisting a tree. Could have been that. This could have been two lovers. I don't know, who knows? I'm guessing, but it was obviously something significant to the people that planted these trees. I just found another twist tree that was on a burial mound yesterday. So who knows? Another really important trail tree, are fording or portage trees. And you want to look for them on the coast, at rivers, streams, and wetlands. And usually they're very high branching for visibility. When I'm walking the trails and I get to a wetland or a stream, and if I can't find that fording tree, I'm in trouble. But what I have found is that if I've been following a trail tree mark route, all I have to do is hunt the ground for a deadfall trail tree. And invariably, it's there. You can find it. And you can judge the best direction to cross the wetland by seeing where the break occurred and then looking for where the fork would have been when upright. And 9 times out of 10, once you get across, you'll find that welcoming tree on the other side. Okay, so this is interesting. Nice little, journey, but what's the importance of all this? Well, what if you find burial mound marker trees? Okay. So the First Nations people, when they buried their dead, they would often put something on the burial mound so that they could identify their kin. So they're actually burial marker trees that are on these burial mounds. They're not on every burial mound. If they're super old burial mounds, potentially the trail trees have died or fallen down. Unfortunately, because of clear cutting, a lot of these trail trees and these marker trees have been cut down. But archaeological features on Crown managed land, especially burial mounds, should trigger consultation before any cuts can happen. Okay, super important. I just want to mention here what this is. This is the backside of a whole line of burial mounds, and this is a road cut plan, tagging tape. So if you can stop a road going in, that's huge. Okay. Now, unfortunately, as you guys all know, no prior environmental nor archaeological assessment is required right now before deforestation. However, documented cultural features should be triggering consultation, okay? This is part of the Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq Nova Scotia, Canada framework. Any documented cultural feature has to trigger consultation. However, our government has not shared the cultural archaeological feature layer of their database with ONUG, even though they have the Mi'kmaq have been requesting it since at least 2007. Okay, so the province is hanging on to this information. So the Mi'kmaq writes, and they're the folks that do the consultations. They've got about 600, almost 700 consultations going on right now, are making their own GIS database because they can't get this information from the province. And the province is not going to tell them, even though they're required to by law, if this stuff is on Crown managed land. Okay, so these folks are making their own database. Okay, so say I'm out there, you, Charlie, or Bob, or whatever, you're out there and you see a mound. How do you know it's a burial mound? Well, Charlie, guess what? If you see pink earth lichen on a damaged mound, it's very, very strong possibility that it could be a burial mound, because this particular type of lichen likes clay. And the way First Nations here in Nova Scotia and across Mi'kmaq buried their dead was flex burials, and they sat them in a certain direction. They piled them over with logs, and then they covered them. The bodies were covered in birch bark, and the hole, which was about 3 feet deep, was then covered in kind of like a teepee of wood, and then it was covered in clay. Okay. So here's an example of a damaged mound that I just saw. I think this must have been, this is one I saw yesterday, I think. And it had signs of clay in it. So the mounds are clay lined. So pink earth lichens also on the trail that goes in are very characteristic of some of these burial mound trails that I've seen. I suspect that they buried their dead, bringing clay with them, and then just kind of threw it on the road and eventually just continue doing that. The trail trees will be leading to or they'll be on the mounds. So if you're seeing trail trees and they're in the area and you're seeing mounds, that's a good sign that these are burial mounds. The age and the type of flora that's growing on these mounds is going to be different from the surroundings. So if you're looking at pit and mound, you're going to have a very rich flora that's going to grow up on that. Well, that's not going to happen on these birch bark line, clay line mounds. Okay, you've got something very different growing on them. You'll often find cherry growing on them and brambles, because the people would go and sit there and eat a little picnic and drop a cherry perhaps, and drop their raspberries and whatever it was they were picnicking on when they went to visit. There's also a pattern in the distribution of these types of mounds. So you're following a trail, you're seeing mounds, but then all of a sudden you get to high ground, and the mounds are there, but they're larger, more imposing. And you'll also see that they're larger whenever you get near a water course. So high status individuals perhaps were being buried there, or perhaps the high ground was just, really popular real estate and they buried more than one person up on the high ground. So that's another sign that these are probably burial mounds that you're seeing. Also cobbles. You'll see cobbles if there's a bit of erosion going on in the mounding. And of course, if there is enough damage, you'll see that they're lined with birch bark. And I have seen a few of them that you can actually see the birch bark jutting out. So that's the end of my short presentation. Is anybody interested in seeing 10 more slides, or shall we stop? It's up to you, Bob.
Well, I can go for more. It's really up to the rest of the crowd too. Let's get everybody on here.
Maybe we'll let people go.
I would just suggest that if people have had enough, they can log off. And if not, we'll just keep going if everybody's okay.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm not going to be offended if someone wants to log off at this point. All right.
I want to see the rest, Mary.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So what if you're also finding cultural plants and other archaeological features? So for example, at this site, this little fork site, that going back to the beginning of my talk, I was finding old growth black cherries in the old growth area. Okay, so that's a cultural plant. Cultural features. This was a long stone wall, and it had a huge old growth red maple growing on it. Okay, so you can see I use a scale, and you can see how huge and old that red maple must be. So we're looking at something old. So go to the next slide. Some features will be glaringly obvious. So in this site, there was a humongous burial mound, huge cultural mound. I don't even know if it was a burial mound. It was so big. It was one of the biggest cultural mounds I've seen. The only place I've seen a bigger cultural mound is there a whole whack load of them in Upper Musquodoboit. And in this little forks, I also found a ridge trail Anybody that's been to the Wallace River hotspot that Doug would refer to knows that there's a ridge trail up on the ridge above the flora. And this also had a similar ridge trail up above flora. So if old oak cultural plants are well established and abundant, all right, so here's Eastern hop hornbeam. I think Doug also mentioned the Eastern hop hornbeam. It was one of the 7, along with the black cherry, very sacred plants of the Mi'kmaq. They actually ate the seeds, but the main thing they used the tree for was for anything that required hard strength. And one of these things was sled runner wood. And in one of the sites that I went to, I walked down a tree trail and I stopped. I was getting tired. I had to turn back at a spot where there was a black cherry, and in the brook that I was about to cross, there was a sled runner, an old sled runner. And I thought, okay, I have to turn back. So I turned back. And then about a month later, another site to the south of that particular cut block went up. So I came from the other direction following a trail, had no idea, but I in fact went through some kind of encampment and ended up at that same sled runner. So very cool experience to come from 2 directions following trail trees. Just an amazing feeling. So another very well-established cultural plant at this Little Fork site is the hawthorn, and at the Wallace River hotspot, you'll also find hawthorn. So other clues, though, can become nagging mysteries. So the Little Fork site really made me wonder whether or not this could have been not just Ulnug in here, but also an Acadian refugee site. So when I travel to the Cape Breton side, I don't get as far as Cape Breton. I'm hoping Beth Sheila and some of the other people are looking at the cut blocks there. I can't get that far. But when I'm into Guysborough, Pictou, Antigonish counties, what I find is the cultural cherry there is mainly pin cherry, not so much the black cherry. And the general consensus is that the Acadians had a much sweeter tooth than the Ulnug. So the fact that there was so much black cherry made me kind of think, because I only found this one pin cherry on this huge cultural mound, and it was a very old pin cherry. So I was thinking maybe that this mound predates the Acadians, but maybe the black cherries were something that they kind of put there. And there's another kind of cherry that I find in sites that I wonder whether or not the Acadians had influence, and it's what I'm calling a white black cherry. So the bark is really light. In fact, it can be so light that sometimes you think that it might be birch, but it's not. And I only have ever seen this in the sites near Spring Hill, Pugwash, Oxford, etc. And I have to go back and see whether or not is this in fact black cherry. Like Sean Blaney says, yeah, it's black cherry, but I want to go and see, I want to taste it and see what the blooms look like. So our exotic species in interesting places. So there's English oak regenerating in the clear cut near the burial mounds. This is the first place I've ever seen English oak growing in one of these clear cut sites. And the burial mounds are just over here, just behind here. The other thing is forget-me-nots. We're all along the stream by the burial mounds. So I did a little bit of research, and it's a European thing to have that flower be symbolic of remembrance. So I don't know for sure whether or not this is native or exotic, because obviously I went in December, but I could see that there were forget-me-nots all the way down the stream. And I have also seen this in other sites, which potentially could have had some Acadian influence. And also, we do know that right after the expulsion, Minudi, Nepan, Macan, and all those spots were immediately, as soon as the British got out of there, as soon as that is it Beausejour, as soon as that area fell, there was a lot of Acadians that suddenly reappeared and settled in those areas, Manuti, McCann, Matan area. And this area here, this Little Forks area would have been very easy spot to hide and then go upriver and get back in there. So anyway, cool stuff like that. But that's to remind me, don't go down that rabbit hole. Because I want to just talk briefly about why is there such a veil of secrecy surrounding Crown managed land? Well, 2 words, cultural genocide. From time immemorial, we know that the people occupied this land. In 1493, the doctrine of discovery was pronounced by the Pope. In 1618, and notice the timing of that, by the way, guys, 1493, 1 year after Columbus discovered the New World. So the doctrine of discovery, for those of you who have never heard of it, just means that if a European or somebody Christian lands in a foreign land and the people there aren't Christian, then by virtue of this doctrine of discovery, you can say that the land is not inhabited by humans, I guess, and you can claim it for your own. So in 1618, this doctrine of discovery was used to justify a French claim to this land. But there were lots of wars with the English, many, many wars with the English. And in 1713, the French negotiated to transfer their title claim to the English without consulting the Mi'kmaq. Now, of course, the First Nations did not like that. And there was a lot of fights. There was French Indian Wars. There was all kinds of things that happened over the next 50 years. But in 1760 and 1761, we've all heard of these peace and friendship treaties, and that's when they happened. And in fact, the English made a royal proclamation that hunting grounds indeed are unceded. However, less than 40 years later, the English pushed as many of the First Nations as they could into 11 reserves in our province. And then 75 years later, the Federal Indian Act was passed, which forbid Indigenous ceremonies right in the act. And in 1927, not only was ceremonial activities forbidden, but also Aboriginal culture and language was specifically forbidden by the feds. So 3 years later, the Shubenacadie Residential School opened, and that served to erase culture and memory. All right. So this is the erasure that happened, that First Nations people could not pass along their knowledge of the land. They could not pass along where their burial sites were, where their trail trees were, what this all meant to them, how sacred this was to them. In 1942, the provincial government went even further, and they tried to push these people into only 2 reserves in Shubenacadie and Eskasoni. Now, it didn't work. A lot of them moved, but a lot of them stayed where they were. And in fact, we actually now do have 13 reserves. And of course, some of these people do live off reserve. So less than 10 years later, finally, the First Nations across Canada were allowed to practice their own spirituality again. This is within some of our lifetimes. 1967, this is certainly within my lifetime, our residential school here in Nova Scotia was finally closed down. And it wasn't until 30 years later, though, with the Marshall II decision, that treaty rights were acknowledged to be a thing, and that the only way they can be limited is by compelling public objectives, including conservation, by the way, for those of you that are nervous about that. In 2007, this Mi'kmaq Nova Scotia Framework Agreement was finally signed. So it took them 8 years to come from the Marshall II decision to the point where they have now got some steps that they go to consult. And then the province this year in March is finally going to officially recognize their language, which is crazy. So we're still not quite there yet. So all this land is, unceded and Crown managed. You notice I don't call it Crown Forest. I can't anymore. Crown mismanaged forest is territory of the Omagh. When these people were moved into reserves, control of their territory was assumed by settler culture. Their children were taken from them, so the elders couldn't pass along their language, knowledge, and traditions. It was deliberate cultural genocide. Now, I'm not going to do this part. I don't feel like I can really speak for the Assembly of First Nations, but if you want to go to their webpage, it's there at the bottom from their mi'kma'rights.com, and they talk about a concept called Netukulimk, okay, it's right here, and it's defined as the use, protection, and stewardship of land and resources provided to all by the Creator for the sustenance and well-being of the Mi'kmaq. Okay, so you can read that yourself. They do have a land strategy. They're in consultation with the province to reclaim control of some surplus and C4 conservation lands. And there is a presentation on this website that I just referred to. And this fellow is Craig Hodder, and he manages their GIS database. And this is specifically what their strategy is looking for. In terms of this whole document, I don't know if it's actually in the public domain, but he has said that they're looking for land adjacent to their communities, existing archaeology sites, coastal lake frontage, future potential wharves, indigenous protected and conserved areas, culturally significant areas, land use activities and opportunities, urban centers, and economic development. And again, there is a presentation on their site about it. All right, thank you for those of you that hung in there. So maybe Bob, unless there's a slide people want me to go back to, maybe can I press stop share? Is that okay by people? Okay.
I can stop. Well, that was great, Mary. You did a wonderful job, and
Thank you
I
for your
learned so much. Really appreciate that.
Thank you for. Are there any other questions? All I can say is it's really fun following those trail trees, guys, and you may get diverted on some of your excursions now and follow one and find something really cool.
Mary, how prevalent are these trail trees in other parts of Nova Scotia? Is it confined, not confined, but more plentiful in the area that you explored, or do you think they're everywhere?
Well, I'll tell you, and I've become strategic in where I go. It's been my experience, and it makes complete sense that the Mi'kmaq like to live near water. So when I see a cut block go up that's near water, that goes right to the top of my priority list. That's where I head. And invariably, unless it's just a swamp, even the swamps they went to, because they went and they were hunting for birds and fish and all kinds of things like that. If there is water, you will find trail trees.
Ah, okay. This is really interesting.
It is.
I'd like to ask about the burial mounds. As we know, they've been identifying burial sites from next to residential schools. Has this been done on any of these burial mounds?
Has what been done, Carol?
LADAR, I think, is what they use.
Oh, I don't know. I would not be surprised. But I mean, they're hiding the cultural archaeological GIS layer from the public and from First Nations. So
but you've actually seen what you think of burial mounds.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
but you don't have proof. But this technology would give you that proof.
Carol, I actually am an archaeologist. So yeah, one of my degrees is environmental archaeology. So I mean, my word is good as the next archaeologist. If I say that it's a burial mound, it 99.9% sure it is. When I'm walking along and I see burial mounds all the way along a trail with trail trees, and yeah, I have absolutely no doubt that they are burial mounds.
But you haven't seen any bones, I take it.
I actually did find a bone that I reported to the police. But no, I have not. I don't do any digging. I don't remove anything from the site. I observe wild flora principles, which is that you go, you observe, you photograph, you might turn something over, but I don't remove anything from the site.
Right, but that's where this technology that's been used near these residential schools would be non-invasive, but would show just where the people are buried.
Yeah. The First Nations people were everywhere in Nova Scotia, especially near water. And again, if you're finding trail trees, if you're finding burial mounds, if you're finding the burial mounds are larger in high areas along the trail, larger along the water, you've got a pattern. So these are burial mounds, and burial mounds have the same protection as a cemetery. You can't disturb them. So if you can document that you've got burial mounds on a cut block and you report that. So what I've been doing, I report it I actually send a little heads up to the Mi'kmaq Rights. So I'm in contact with their archaeologist. I send a little heads up to them about why I believe this is a site, a cultural site. And then I'll write my comment to the province. And right at the beginning of the comment, I say, let me just read to you what I say, because if you guys are doing this too, and I hope you guys do, because I can't get everywhere, as you know. Let me just find an example. Okay, very first thing I say is consultation with First Nations must, and I put that in block letters, be done before the clear-cut plans for whatever it is proceed. I tell them when I visited the land, and I tell them what I observe. I observe burial mounds, cultural flora, trail trees, and many other unusual archaeological features, if I had observed unusual archaeological features. So the site for Little Forks, I say including stone walls and berms and a constructed ridge trail along the access roads and into the blocks. And then I also talk about the ecology of the area as well, because sometimes there is a way that they can get a little bit of a cut in there. Like if I find a monoculture plantation on the site of a certain size. So on this particular site, there was a monoculture European red pine plantation. So I tell them about that, but I also tell them if there's something globally endangered. For example, native ash was on that site. So that's the type of thing I say, and it seems to have put the brakes on a lot of the cutting in my area.
Well done, Mary.
Wow.
Mary, Mary, there's some of these sites that there's no hope of ever getting into. I'm looking at some of the current ones. It's still under consultation down in Guysborough County.
Okay, I'm going. Is that Carol Bradley?
Yep.
Carol, I'm going to try and get to that site. What I did, like yesterday, I went to a site where I had to walk an hour to get into it. The day before, I went to a site where I had to walk 2 hours to get into it. So I am going to try and get into that site.
Oh my God.
I'm going to go on Wednesday.
Yeah, you are a saint. I do appreciate your work so much.
Meeting, I'll call you back, okay?
Sorry?
Bye.
I think Rochelle is talking to somebody else. I
I'm
don't know.
sorry, I just got a long distance call and I told her I was on the Zoom meeting, pardon me. When you're finished, I have a question.
Okay.
I'm just going to go back to Carol Bradley. Carol, yeah, because that site has got a huge lake on it.
Yes.
It's even got a beautiful island in the middle of the lake, Mitchell Lake, it's called, right?
I think I'm going to put in a general comment because that's all I can do. But perhaps I'll be in touch with you separately and we can talk about getting to some of the ones in Hants County and Halifax County where you can't get.
Okay, I've tried to get to them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, at least the one, well, I can't show, but did you see that? All those red marks? There was a lot of them in Hants County. And
Yes, I did. And that's interesting because like I got to that site out behind the Drescher Mines as well in Walton.
Oh,
But,
good. Yes, I did too. Yeah.
Yeah, partly I don't know what to look for. Anyhow, I'll be in touch perhaps separately then. If
Okay.
that's okay?
Yeah. Thanks, Carol.
Right.
Rochelle?
Yes, you mentioned stone walls twice.
Yes.
What exactly do stone walls have to do with this?
Stone walls, I think it's an Acadian site. I think it's an Acadian refuge site. I think they were probably there in 1758 or 59. I think the Acadians, if you look on the map, if you go up, I think it's either the Macan or the Napan River, you get to Menuti, which was a super popular site for the Acadians. And when the British came in 1759 and the expulsions, et cetera, happened, they didn't catch all the Acadians. We know that. We know that the women for sure got away. And we also know that Menuti and Napan and Macan almost immediately after the British got out of there and went back to Halifax, they were back. They were back farming. So where had they gone? I think this is a site where they had gone. I think that's what the evidence is showing us. But I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole.
So the idea would be that the Acadians might have built stone walls near existing burial mounds, or that the burial mounds were still being built.
I think they would have buried. They were intermarrying. They'd been there since the 1600s.
Mhm.
There was intermarrying. There was a lot of cultural interchange that was happening. I'll tell you, I found at the burial mound site, there was a wooden cross on a tree. So. So is everybody happy to go now? Are you guys ready for sleep?
That was a major thing to put together, Mary.
Yeah, really, that could have been a full evening right there, Mary. That was good.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, guys. Well, it's really important stuff. And I wanted you guys to know what I had been doing because I haven't reported to you since the summer. So
Well, thanks for putting all that effort into it too, for the presentation.
you're welcome. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mary.
Okay, well, if we're done, I'm gonna say goodbye to everybody and end our meeting.
Oh, wait a second. There's a couple of questions. Sorry.
All right, okay, go ahead.
Have you reported any of these sites to the Mi'kmaq? Yes, I report them to Mi'kmaq rights, to their archaeology department. And then, she left. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Bob.